They say that the people closest to you are the hardest to truly know. I used to scoff at that idea. After all, I had spent over 30 years with Linda, raised 3 kids, survived ups and downs, and had grown accustomed to our quiet rhythm. She was my partner in every sense of the word, a calm, measured woman with a deep intelligence and a way of being that I respected. From the outside, we looked like any other couple winding down into our later years. But now, as I sit here looking back, I can see how those small, unsettling pieces started to appear, like bits of a puzzle tossed onto a table without a clear picture to follow. It's strange to admit, but we hadn't met in the usual way. It wasn't through friends or work or some family event. No, we met by complete chance. I was volunteering at a local library one stormy afternoon, a shift I took to pass the time and meet others in the community. Linda had stumbled in that day, drenched from the rain and clearly a little lost. She wandered into the back where we had a book club discussion going on and took a seat just listening. Eventually, she joined the conversation, sharing something personal, a story about a time in her life when she'd felt directionless. It was like she was looking for something right then, not just shelter from the storm. We ended up talking for hours after everyone else had left, and I remember thinking she was something rare, someone I wanted to keep close. As time went on, she became just that, the one constant in my life. We built everything together, a home, a family, and a life that, to the untrained eye, looked about as normal as you'd expect. And it was until recently. It started so gradually that I can't pinpoint the exact moment. Just small things, little shifts in her routines, subtle changes in the way she acted around me. The feeling I had about it? Well, at first it was just that, a feeling. The first clue was almost laughable. Linda started taking these long, early morning walks. She'd never been much of a morning person, so I chalked it up to some kind of new health kick. But then I noticed something odd. She always went at the same time, and every time she came back, there was a subtle shift in her mood. Not better, not worse, just different. She'd go from being cheerful to a bit distant, like her mind was somewhere else. Then, there was the perfume. Linda's always been subtle with her fragrance, but after these walks, I started noticing a different scent on her, sharper and unfamiliar. I shrugged it off for a while. We'd been together long enough that routines became second nature, and I trusted her. I wasn't about to start acting paranoid over a change in perfume. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over time, the changes grew bolder, as if she'd become a different person in phases. First, she stopped going on about her support group, a hobby she'd picked up out of nowhere a few months prior. Initially, I teased her about it, saying that lonely housewives sounded like the premise of a bad soap opera. She'd laugh it off, but I noticed she stopped mentioning it altogether, almost as if it was meant to be forgotten. One morning, a few weeks later, I noticed a detail that really set off alarm bells. We'd always kept our finances straightforward, with everything divided between household bills and a bit of savings on the side. But that day, I saw a letter sticking out of her purse, a bank statement. Nothing suspicious at first, but the account name was unfamiliar. I didn't snoop. Instead, I asked her casually, "Everything all right with our finances?" She looked at me with what I could only describe as forced calm and brushed it off, saying she'd opened a small personal account to keep things easier for her projects. Projects? In all our years together, Linda had never taken on anything she called projects. Still, I kept my expression calm and let it slide, trying not to make anything of it. Yet, that uneasy feeling persisted, gnawing away in the back of my mind, whispering that this was just the tip of the iceberg. From that point on, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something deeper was going on. But Linda wasn't an easy woman to read. She had a calm that always bordered on impenetrable, and even when we were young, she rarely betrayed her thoughts with expressions or gestures. That calmness had been part of what attracted me to her. She was a steady counterbalance to my more straightforward and, some would say, intense nature. After the bank statement incident, I decided it was time to pay attention. Not paranoid, not obsessed, just a quiet, intentional observation. If there was something beneath the surface, I'd find it. For the next few weeks, I kept a closer eye on her routines and any changes in her behavior, biding my time and letting the pieces slowly come together. One night, When she was out at a meeting for her so-called support group, I took a walk of my own. I decided to take a longer route through our neighborhood, something I hadn't done in a long time. As I walked, my mind drifted back to the early years of our marriage. I remembered the weekends we used to spend outdoors, our hikes in the state park, and the quiet evenings that often ended in conversations that stretched late into the night. Those days felt distant now, as if they belonged to a different life. Eventually, I found myself walking past a small cafe about a mile from our house. It was one of those places we'd been to together once or twice, but rarely frequented. I wouldn't have thought twice about it if it hadn't been for what I saw next. There, in the dim light from the cafe's window, sat Linda with a man I didn't recognize. They were leaning in close, her face animated in a way I hadn't seen in years. They looked absorbed in each other's company, laughing in a way that felt far too intimate for someone I'd never heard of. My heart hammered, but I stayed put, watching from the shadows across the street. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe he was someone from her support group or a friend I hadn't met. But as I stood there, a sense of clarity settled over me. There was no support group. I didn't know who this man was, but it was painfully clear to me that he was more than just a casual acquaintance. When she returned home later that night, I was sitting in the living room, reading, or at least pretending to. She gave me a breezy smile, one that didn't quite meet her eyes, and I felt a pang of cold realization as she casually mentioned how the support group meeting had been pretty standard. I nodded, not letting on that I knew more than she thought. I'd always prided myself on being rational, and I wasn't about to lose my composure. I needed proof, a concrete understanding of what was going on before I made any accusations. Confronting her without a solid foundation would only give her the chance to brush it all aside. Over the next few days, I put my patience to the test. Her morning walks, her locked phone, her occasional late nights, all took on a new meaning. She was consistent, careful, but there were minor slips. I began noticing a new phone number popping up on the caller ID, always during times when I wasn't home, and always erased from the call log afterward. The oddest detail came when I noticed a new set of car keys on her key ring. Our car was an older model, and these keys looked far too polished, far too recent. I knew Linda well enough to know that she wouldn't rent a car just for fun, but she also hadn't mentioned buying anything new. This raised an interesting question. If she was driving a different car, what was she trying to keep hidden? I didn't confront her about the keys, but I noted the details, letting the puzzle slowly assemble in my mind. The final piece I needed would come soon enough, I told myself. And when it did, I would be ready. After discovering the unfamiliar car keys, I realized that Linda was far more careful than I had thought. But two could play this game, and patience was something I had in ample supply. I needed to think logically, to approach this without letting any personal feelings get in the way. That was my advantage. A few days later, Linda told me she'd be heading out of town for the weekend to attend a retreat with her support group. She was almost too casual about it, saying she'd be back Sunday evening. I nodded along, acting as though I believed her, while internally, I began to form a plan. I had no idea where she was really going, but I intended to find out. That Saturday morning, I waited until she left before grabbing my keys. I'd remembered something interesting. An old friend of mine, Dave, had recently retired from the police force, where he'd worked as a detective. We kept in touch here and there, and I figured it was time to pay him a visit. Dave greeted me with his usual half-smirk, the kind that always told me he knew more than he was letting on. We sat down over coffee, and I laid out the situation, sparing no details. He listened, nodding thoughtfully. "Doesn't sound like much of a support group, if you ask me," he said with a knowing look. "You want me to help you track her down? Just tell me where to start," I replied. "If there's a way to get a look at where she's really going without tipping her off, I'm all ears." Dave nodded, thinking it over. "All right, we can use her car's plates. I still have some contacts who can pull records and maybe get us a GPS location on the rental if it's registered through a big company. You sure about this, though? Once you start, there's no turning back." I gave him a curt nod. I knew what I was getting into, but I needed the truth. Dave made a few calls, and within the hour, he had a possible lead on her location, a hotel an hour outside of town. She'd booked under a different last name, something I hadn't anticipated. He wrote down the address, handed it to me, and clapped me on the shoulder. "Whatever you're about to find, don't lose your head," he said. "You're in control of this, not her." I thanked him, and as I left, a sense of purpose settled over me. I had never been one to play detective, but this felt different. It wasn't about curiosity. It was about restoring a sense of honesty to my life. I was about to find out what my wife was really doing, and no matter what, I would be prepared for whatever truth lay waiting. That evening, I drove to the hotel, keeping a low profile. I spotted her car in the parking lot, those shiny new keys finally making sense. My stomach tightened as I realized I was only a few steps away from uncovering the truth. I waited in my car, watching the entrance. After about an hour, I saw Linda coming out of the hotel, laughing and clinging to the arm of the man from the cafe. They looked comfortable, familiar, like this was a routine. I clenched my fists, feeling the anger pulse through me, but I kept myself in check. I wasn't about to make a scene. No, this was a game of patience, and I needed to keep the upper hand. I snapped a few photos, making sure I had something concrete. But I knew my next steps needed to be just as strategic. This was only part of the picture, and I needed more to truly understand the scope of what she was hiding. I drove back home in silence, every mile solidifying my resolve. This wasn't just an affair. It was a different life she had built without me. And now, I had a new mission, to dismantle it piece by piece, without her suspecting a thing. By the time Linda returned home Sunday night, I had already set the next phase of my plan into motion. She breezed through the door, her face glowing and her expression light, as though she'd spent the weekend doing something far more satisfying than self-care and meditation. I noted the small details she overlooked, a slight smudge of lipstick on her collar and a hint of wine on her breath. It was like she didn't even care if she covered her tracks. I played my part, acting the distracted husband, barely looking up from the book I wasn't actually reading. "How was the retreat?" I asked casually, flipping a page. "Oh, relaxing," she replied a little too quickly. "Just a lot of time to recharge." She dropped her bag by the door, avoiding my gaze, and I caught the smallest flash of hesitation in her expression. I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "Glad to hear it. You seem energized." She shot me a curious look, but I didn't offer anything more. I knew enough not to give her a reason to dig, to keep her feeling secure. Letting her think she was clever, that she was still one step ahead, was part of the game. Once she had settled in, I excused myself, retreating upstairs to make a few preparations for what would come next. This wasn't about confronting her. It was about control. I wanted her to believe that her secrets were safe, that she was in the clear, even as I quietly dismantled the life she thought she'd hidden so well. With each passing day, I kept up appearances, acting as if everything was fine. Linda resumed her usual routines, morning walks, her support group meetings, and now the occasional weekend retreat. But I was no longer in the dark. I had a mission: gather as much information as possible without her suspecting a thing. Every interaction with her felt like a game, a subtle dance of pretending and planning, and the longer I played it, the clearer my course of action became. A few days later, I decided to take advantage of an upcoming neighborhood event, a small gathering hosted by a mutual friend. Linda and I had been planning to go, and I realized it could be the perfect opportunity to learn more about this other life she was leading. If she'd woven this secret into the fabric of her daily life, there was a good chance someone else in our circle knew about it, even if only by accident. People tend to talk when they've had a few drinks. The evening arrived, and I played my role perfectly. I was cordial, joking with neighbors, and greeting friends with the usual warmth. Linda, meanwhile, floated around the room like she was hosting the event herself, charming and animated. I watched as she drifted into different conversations, easily moving from one group to the next. I could see why no one suspected a thing. She was flawless, every detail polished to perfection. As the evening wore on, I spotted a potential lead: Caroline, a woman Linda had become close to over the past year. Caroline wasn't part of our usual circle, and she seemed to have been Linda's confidant lately. I'd caught glimpses of them talking in low voices at various events, and Linda had casually dropped Caroline's name more often than usual. I joined their conversation, and after a few minutes, Linda excused herself to catch up with someone. Perfect. Caroline and I were left standing alone, and I decided to ease into my questions. Linda's been really busy with that support group of hers lately, I remarked casually, swirling my drink. She barely has time to keep up with all her other projects. Caroline raised her eyebrows, glancing over at me with an expression that told me I'd hit a nerve. She hesitated, and then let out a small laugh. "Oh, right, that group she's always going on about. It's funny she never mentioned it to me until recently, and I thought we were close." She shrugged, sipping her drink, but I saw the curiosity there, as if she'd been wondering about it herself. "Oh," I replied, feigning interest. "I guess she's just private about it." Caroline paused, looking over at Linda from across the room. "She told me it was more of a special interest group," she said, her voice dropping. "Something about meeting like-minded people, though she's always been vague on the details." I didn't push. I figured if it was that important, she'd tell me more eventually. A special interest group? That was the first time I'd heard it put that way. I stored the phrase in my mind, making a note to investigate further. Caroline clearly knew something was off, but she hadn't pieced it together yet. For now, I would leave it that way. When Linda and I returned home that night, I felt a new surge of determination. Her special interest group was the next thread I needed to pull, and I was ready to find out where it would lead. This was no longer just about discovering the truth. It was about using that truth to build a foundation for the quiet, cold revenge I had been crafting in my mind. The following week, Linda announced she'd be attending another weekend retreat with her so-called support group. This time, she hardly even bothered to elaborate. Her story was thinner than ever, and I could see the faintest flicker of doubt in her eyes, as if she suspected I might be catching on. But I didn't give her any reason to worry. I simply nodded, keeping my expression unreadable, and wished her a relaxing time. The moment she left, I sprang into action. I'd learned enough from Caroline's slip about the special interest group to take my investigation in a new direction. It wasn't just a group of friends, that much was clear. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was something larger at play, something with rules and secrecy. I needed to know exactly what she'd gotten involved in. I started with the basics, reaching out to Dave again for advice. This time, I asked him to look into a few people Linda had recently been spending time with, names I'd heard in passing or that she'd mentioned in conversation. If there was any pattern in their lives, any connection to this mysterious group, I wanted to know about it. Dave, ever the detective, agreed without hesitation. Over the next few days, as Dave started gathering information, I noticed something that only confirmed my suspicions. I had begun receiving emails from unfamiliar addresses, vague messages from people claiming to be associated with Linda's group, offering everything from support to guidance. At first, it seemed like spam, but when one email addressed me directly by name and referred to a recent retreat Linda had attended, I knew these weren't accidental. They were connected to her secret life. The emails were cryptic, each one signed with only initials or an alias, and they always arrived late at night, as though sent in secrecy. Some contained strange references to commitment and dedication to the cause. One email even hinted at gatherings held in a secluded location, away from prying eyes. The more I read, the clearer it became that this group had a structured hierarchy, meetings, and an agenda Linda had never mentioned. By now, it was obvious to me that Linda was part of something larger, something that demanded a level of loyalty she hadn't shown to our marriage in years. But the question remained, how deep was she in? And what exactly was this group trying to accomplish? The answer came sooner than I expected. On the night Linda was set to return, Dave called. "Michael," he said, his voice grave. "This group you asked me to look into, they're not just a social club. It's more organized than that. From what I've found, they run a kind of underground network. For some people, it's a networking thing. For others, well, let's just say it's more personal." "More personal?" I echoed, barely able to contain my curiosity. "Yeah," he said. "I'm talking about people using this group to connect with partners. Affairs, hidden relationships. It's all under the radar. People meet, trade contacts, and keep it completely out of the public eye. From what I've seen, they have a few key members who coordinate it all, making sure everything stays quiet." The pieces began to fall into place. Linda wasn't just having a fling. She was part of a whole network that protected and encouraged this double life. My mind raced, but I kept calm. Now, I didn't just have the truth. I had leverage. I could unravel her world, expose her carefully constructed facade, and I knew exactly how to do it. When Linda walked through the door later that night, looking flushed and content, she had no idea that her life was about to take a drastic turn. As she set her bags down, I greeted her warmly, hiding my newfound knowledge behind a mask of indifference. She didn't suspect a thing, and that was just how I wanted it. The real plan was about to begin. I would start by pulling apart the web she'd woven around herself, one thread at a time, until everything she'd kept hidden came crashing down. The next day, I began laying the groundwork for my plan. Linda's secret network was designed to protect her, to keep her hidden life untouchable. But now that I knew the rules of her game, I could break them. She'd trusted this group to safeguard her secrets, but it wouldn't take much to turn that protection against her. My first move was subtle but calculated. Over the next few days, I started calling her close friends, one by one. Not the women in her support group, but the friends she'd known for years, ones who weren't part of her new social circle. In each conversation, I dropped a casual remark about Linda's new interest group, implying that it seemed a bit unconventional. "Oh, she hasn't told you much about it?" I'd ask, letting curiosity spark without saying too much. The effect was immediate. Each friend sounded surprised, as if they'd been in the dark too. They asked questions, wondering why Linda hadn't mentioned it. "It's probably nothing," I'd say with a dismissive chuckle. "But she's been pretty involved, almost like it's taken over her weekends. You know how these things can be." I could feel the unease creeping into their voices, doubt beginning to form. With a few simple hints, I'd planted seeds of suspicion, knowing it wouldn't take long for those to grow. Linda, meanwhile, seemed oblivious or maybe overconfident. She went about her days, slipping in and out of her routines, assuming I hadn't noticed a thing. She would come home late from meetings, always with a vague excuse and a smile. But the cracks in her facade were becoming more apparent. And the more she thought her secret was safe, the more her confidence would work against her. The next phase of my plan involved gathering proof, solid evidence that would paint a picture no one could deny. I wanted more than just blurry photos from a distance. With Dave's help, I managed to acquire records of the anonymous email accounts sending her messages. Their content hinted at clandestine meetings, carefully orchestrated gatherings, and encrypted lists of members. Dave didn't ask how I planned to use the information, and I was grateful for that. He was sharp enough to see this was personal. I didn't stop there. Using the information from Dave, I found out about another retreat scheduled for the following month. I booked a room at the same hotel, making sure to use a name Linda wouldn't recognize. I wanted to see her in action, to watch her as she moved through this secret life she'd so carefully crafted. The night of the retreat arrived, and I checked in, positioning myself at a table near the bar, hidden behind a newspaper. Sure enough, Linda appeared around 8 p.m., her posture relaxed, her face alight as she joined a group of people. I recognized a few faces from the photos Dave had shared, men and women who were similarly entwined in their double lives. As I watched her laughing with them, leaning in as if every word was a secret, the reality of her betrayal hit harder than ever. But it also strengthened my resolve. Watching her live this lie made me realize how easily I could turn her world upside down. All I had to do was let her believe she was safe, let her continue spinning this web, right up until the moment I was ready to strike. In the weeks that followed, I continued to play my role, silently gathering information and staying one step ahead. I began compiling every piece of evidence into a single, organized file, dates, times, photos, and emails, all ready for the day I'd finally bring it all into the open. But that day wasn't here yet. There was one more step to take, one final move to ensure her world would unravel just as she'd unraveled mine. As I continued gathering information, I realized I needed a more personal touch for the final phase of my plan. It wasn't enough to confront Linda directly. That would be too simple. No, I wanted her to feel the weight of her own decisions, to experience the consequences slowly, as the walls she'd so carefully constructed came crumbling down around her. One evening, after she left for yet another support group meeting, I visited her close friend, Claire. Claire had known Linda since college, and they kept in touch, though they'd grown apart over the years. Claire was one of the few people who'd expressed genuine surprise when I'd mentioned Linda's special interest group. I knew if anyone had Linda's ear and influence, it was her. I rang the bell, and Claire answered, looking curious. "Michael, this is unexpected." "Claire, I thought it might be best if we talked about something in person." "It's about Linda," I said, keeping my tone serious. I could see the concern in her eyes, and she led me inside without a word. I started slow, describing how Linda had been acting differently, how her time with this support group had consumed her weekends and changed her in ways I couldn't ignore. I left out the more incriminating details, letting Claire fill in the gaps with her imagination. Finally, I leaned in, lowering my voice as if I was sharing a painful truth. "Claire, I don't know how to say this, but I don't think this group is what Linda says it is. I've seen things, emails, messages, things that don't sit right, and I'm worried about her." Her eyes widened, and I could see the doubt and concern start to take root. "Michael, are you saying that maybe this group isn't legitimate?" I nodded slowly, as though it pained me to admit it. "I'm not sure what it is exactly, but I think there's something darker going on. I don't want to assume anything, but I don't want her to get hurt either. I thought, maybe if you could talk to her, find out what's really going on." Claire's expression hardened, her protectiveness flaring up. "Of course, Michael. I'll talk to her. She's my friend, and if she's caught up in something, she needs to know we're here for her. She deserves better than this." I thanked her, knowing that I'd planted yet another seed. This wasn't about turning her friends against her outright. No, I wanted to create a small ripple, a whisper that would eventually grow into a storm. Claire's well-meaning intervention would only deepen Linda's anxiety, make her question the security of the life she'd built. A few days later, I saw the effects of my visit to Claire unfold. Linda came home looking troubled, her usual cheerful facade cracking just slightly. She paced the living room, making vague comments about friendships being complicated and how people just don't understand. She seemed distracted, distant, her mind clearly wrestling with something. "Everything all right?" I asked, feigning ignorance. She nodded, but didn't meet my gaze. "Yeah, just some drama with Claire. I'll figure it out." I kept my expression neutral, careful not to show even a hint of satisfaction. Inside, though, I knew my plan was working. Linda's carefully controlled world was beginning to fracture, and I hadn't even revealed the full extent of her betrayal yet. With each passing day, I watched her tension grow, her grip on her secret life loosening as I pulled the threads around her. I had laid my traps carefully, knowing that soon, very soon, the time would come for Linda to face the truth. Not just about her affair, but about everything she'd hidden and everyone she'd betrayed. And when that time came, I'd be ready. Over the following week, I could see Linda growing more and more unsettled. She became quieter, more distracted, as if the weight of her double life was finally starting to press down on her. And she'd started to suspect something, although she couldn't pinpoint exactly what. That doubt was beginning to gnaw at her composure, fraying the mask she wore so perfectly. Meanwhile, I kept my own expression calm, never hinting at what I knew or what I'd said in emotion. But I could see her nervousness in the way she'd glance at me from across the room, how she'd pause before answering a simple question, how her eyes would flicker with worry if I lingered on a particular topic. That tension in her gaze told me everything I needed to know. She was starting to lose control. But I wasn't finished yet. I still had one last piece to put in place, one more move to pull her deeper into the trap. That Friday, I waited until she'd left the house, supposedly for a quick errand, before calling up Claire again. It had been nearly 2 weeks since I'd first gone to her with my concerns, and from what I could tell, she and Linda hadn't resolved things. It was perfect timing. "Claire, it's Michael," I said when she picked up, sounding serious. "I think there's something you need to know." Claire's response was immediate, her voice tinged with worry. "Michael, is everything all right?" "Not exactly," I replied, carefully choosing my words. "After we last talked, I did some digging. I found more evidence about the group Linda's been involved with. It's complicated, but I'm certain now that it's not just some harmless social gathering. There's more to it than that, and I'm afraid she might be in over her head." There was a brief silence on the other end before she spoke, her tone soft but resolute. "Michael, what are you saying? Are you implying that she's—" "Look," I interrupted gently. "I don't want to make any assumptions. But I found a series of transactions, emails from this group, messages with a particular tone. They make it clear that there's a hidden side to it, something that seems to involve more than just networking." I paused, letting the information sink in before continuing. "If you think you could try talking to her again, maybe asking her if she's all right. It might be good for her to know she has a friend to lean on, someone she can be honest with." Claire agreed, her tone now laced with a renewed sense of duty. She sounded worried, but also determined to get to the bottom of this for her friend's sake. As I hung up, I felt a faint satisfaction settle over me. Linda wouldn't be able to brush Claire off this time, not with the seeds of doubt I'd planted, coupled with the growing tension already straining her. I knew Linda well enough to understand that this would be the tipping point. She was careful, yes, but her nerves were starting to unravel. And with her confidence shaken, her judgment would soon begin to slip. That night, I kept my demeanor cool, pretending to be engrossed in a book as Linda came in from her errand. She looked tense, her face slightly flushed, and I wondered if she'd already caught wind of Claire's renewed interest. She didn't say anything to me as she busied herself in the kitchen, barely making eye contact. It was a small, telling detail, and I knew that she was rattled. For the rest of the evening, I watched her from the corner of my eye, noting every slight hesitation, every nervous glance. It was as if she was waiting for something to happen, as if she could feel the walls closing in but couldn't figure out how or why. Finally, just as we were about to turn in for the night, she cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "Michael, I wanted to ask you something," she said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sure," I replied, glancing up, feigning nonchalance. Have you talked to Claire recently?" I paused, just for a second, letting her wonder if she'd hit a nerve. "I did, actually," I said, watching her reaction carefully. "She's worried about you, you know? About this group you're part of. She thinks, well, she's worried it might be a bit more intense than you've let on." She froze, caught off guard, before quickly recovering. "Oh, Claire," she said, forcing a laugh that sounded almost desperate. "She's always been a bit overprotective. It's really just a harmless group. I told her as much." "Harmless, huh?" I said, keeping my tone neutral. It doesn't sound like she believes that. And to be honest, I'm not sure I do either. "There's been a lot you haven't mentioned, Linda." Her eyes darted away, her face pale. For a brief second, I could see panic flash across her features, but she quickly composed herself, pasting on that calm, familiar mask. "Michael, it's really nothing," she said, her voice too even. "You know me. I wouldn't get mixed up in anything strange." But her words sounded hollow, even to her. And in that moment, I knew she could feel it slipping away. The control, the confidence, everything she thought she'd concealed so well. That night, I left her to her own thoughts, saying nothing more. I wanted her to sit with her unease, to wonder what I knew and how much. I wanted her to question every decision, every lie, every betrayal she'd so carefully hidden. And I could see in her eyes that she was beginning to doubt if she'd ever truly been in control at all. The next day, she left the house in a hurry, saying she had a meeting to attend. She didn't look back as she went out the door, which suited me just fine. I already knew exactly where she was going, and I had my next move planned. An hour later, I sent a message to an old contact of mine, an acquaintance who worked with a local newspaper and who specialized in exposing secrets hidden in plain sight. I'd never had much reason to use his services before, but now I saw the perfect opportunity. I told him about Linda's support group, framing it as a story about a secretive society that encouraged its members to lead double lives. It was only a matter of time before he'd dig into it, and once he did, he'd find the same trail I'd followed, linking Linda and her group to the very kind of scandal that would destroy the reputation she held so dear. When Linda returned that evening, she looked more rattled than ever, and I could see the signs of strain, the tight lines around her mouth, the way her eyes darted about, unable to settle. It was as if she sensed a storm approaching, one she couldn't escape. But she had no idea that I was the one behind it, the one pulling every string. Over the next week, the tension only built. I watched as Linda grew more paranoid, as she started glancing over her shoulder, answering her phone in hushed tones, and even double-checking the locks on the doors. Her once perfect mask was cracking, and with it, any control she thought she still held. Then, one evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and I saw her face go pale. She quickly excused herself and went upstairs, locking herself in our bedroom. I waited a few minutes before following, positioning myself outside the door, just in time to hear her frantic voice on the phone. "Yes, but how did they find out?" she whispered urgently. "No, I don't know who could have told them. No one knew." The satisfaction I felt was almost intoxicating. She was realizing, slowly and painfully, that her world was falling apart, that her secrets were bleeding into the open, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As she paced in the room, I backed away, heading downstairs to give her privacy. I didn't need to hear more. I'd already accomplished what I'd set out to do. Linda's carefully constructed life was coming undone, and she was trapped, unable to salvage any part of it without exposing herself entirely. Over the next few days, as word of her group began to trickle through the grapevine, I kept my distance, watching with a quiet satisfaction as her reputation slowly disintegrated. She received fewer calls from friends, avoided gatherings, and even missed her usual meetings, no doubt afraid of what more might come to light if she did. And as for me, I maintained the role of the calm, unassuming husband, waiting patiently as Linda's life fell apart, one careful piece at a time. Linda's spiral was almost complete. Over the past week, I watched as her paranoia transformed her from the calm, composed woman I'd once known into someone barely able to keep up appearances. She was always checking her phone, glancing out windows, her once confident expression now a mask of constant worry. Our interactions were brief, strained. I barely needed to say a word. Her own guilt was enough to unnerve her. The final move was now in my hands. With everything I'd set in motion, the unraveling of her friendships, the whispers of scandal, the slow disintegration of her secret life, there was only one thing left: to confront her with the full truth and deliver my final blow. I'd waited for this moment, let it build, giving her just enough time to realize that her life was crumbling beyond her control. Now, I'd make sure she understood exactly why. That Sunday evening, I invited Linda to sit down with me. She hesitated, no doubt sensing that whatever was coming couldn't be avoided any longer. I could see the shadows in her eyes, a growing realization that this wasn't just another casual conversation. She took a seat, her posture tense, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Linda," I began, my tone calm, "I think it's time we talked. About everything." She flinched, her hands tightening around the edge of the chair. But I continued without waiting for her response. "I know about the group," I said evenly. "I know about the retreats, the meetings, the people you've been meeting. I know that this group isn't just about support." Her face drained of color, and she tried to muster some form of defense, but words failed her. She looked at me with an expression that wavered between disbelief and dread. "Michael, it's not what you think," she stammered. "Really?" I replied, keeping my voice steady. "So, you weren't part of an entire network designed to help people lead double lives? You didn't build an entire world around lies and secrecy?" Linda's mouth opened as if to argue, but nothing came out. I continued, each word sharper than the last. "I know about your partner. I know about the retreats. I even know about the network of people who enabled all of it. And I know that everything you told me, the support group, the weekend trips, were just excuses." I paused, letting that sink in. "You weren't just lying to me, Linda. You were lying to yourself." She sat there, stunned, the impact of my words hitting her harder than anything she'd imagined. The mask she wore, that calm, self-assured veneer, finally crumbled completely. "Michael," she began, her voice breaking. I didn't mean for it to go this far." I shook my head, cutting her off. "It went exactly as far as you let it. And now everyone knows. Your friends, your family. They've all heard the rumors. They've seen the cracks. Your carefully built world, that perfect image you've been protecting, it's all falling apart." Her face contorted, shifting from shock to horror, as the full extent of what I'd done became clear. "You did this?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "You told them? You ruined everything." "No, Linda," I replied calmly, standing up. "You ruined everything. All I did was pull back the curtain you'd so carefully drawn. All I did was make sure the truth had its day." She sat there, staring blankly, as the reality of her situation washed over her. There was no escaping it, no talking her way out of this one. The truth had stripped away every last illusion she'd wrapped herself in, leaving her exposed, vulnerable, with nothing left to hide behind. We sat in silence for a long moment before I finally spoke again. "We both know there's no going back from this," I said, my voice steady. "I'll be filing for divorce." Linda looked up at me, her face a mix of fear and despair. What about everything we built? The house, the family?" Her voice was barely a whisper now. "That's for the court to decide," I replied, unmoved. "But as far as I'm concerned, this marriage is over." The words hit her like a final blow. She seemed to shrink, as though all the energy, the confidence she once held, had been drained from her. She nodded numbly, her gaze fixed on the floor, as though facing a reality she'd been too afraid to acknowledge. The silence that followed was heavy, as if everything left unsaid between us finally settled, sealing the fate of what once was. In the weeks that followed, the fallout of Linda's choices became even more apparent. Word of her involvement in the group continued to spread, whispers of her double life now an open secret in our community. Her friends, once loyal and close, began to distance themselves, choosing to avoid the scandal that now clung to her like a shadow. Her professional contacts waned, and even her job became uncertain as rumors circulated. I stayed silent, detached, watching as the full extent of her betrayal came back to haunt her. Our divorce was finalized with little fuss. With our children grown, there was no question of custody, and I kept the family home, while Linda moved into a small apartment in a part of town far from our old life. Her reputation, once pristine, was irreparably damaged, and the life she'd built in the shadows of lies had disintegrated before her eyes. As for me, I found an unexpected peace in the aftermath. I resumed the hobbies I'd once set aside, reconnected with old friends, and spent more time with family. I felt no joy in her ruin, no pleasure in her pain, just a quiet sense of closure. Linda had chosen her path, and I'd merely ensured that it led to the truth. In the end, I had gained something invaluable, the freedom to live without deception, without shadows. And as I moved forward, I carried with me a hard-earned lesson, a reminder that betrayal, no matter how carefully concealed, would always find its way into the light.